story, I always like to let you guys know all the different things you can do out here with your limited time, since I know you guys have to be back on the Creole Queen pretty quickly. Starting with that big pink house out there. That pink house was not here during the battle. It was built about 18 years afterwards, and it was a summer home for a wealthy widow named Madeline Malou. Had a wide variety of private owners, and then eventually became the Park Service's first visitor center. Unfortunately, however, you cannot go inside. You're not missing a whole bunch. It's completely empty, and it's not completely historically accurate. We have things like security systems, water, sewage pipes, all that sort of stuff. But you are more than welcome to walk around the outside and kind of get a feel for what this Greek Revival architecture or about 1870s era architecture might have looked like. Next is this small building back here. It's probably the number one question I get asked. Those are your restrooms right there for you. And they are air conditioned. Then we have our visitor center to my right. Inside we have a couple great films, especially the one with the map down below. If you're really interested in the specific battle tactics, the different lines, I suggest watching that film. It really kind of shows what was happening with all the different troop movements at the battle. Then on the far side of that, we have our tall obelisk there. It's about 100 feet tall and about 122 steps from the door to the viewing platform up top. If you do decide to go up there, we ask that you hold on to the railing. It's a fairly narrow spiral staircase. And once you get to the top, there's a decent little breeze, but it is a bit warm as you go up. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We're just going to have a very short talk here, and if you have any questions afterwards, we'll go inside and you get a chance to answer those. We're just going to try to beat out the rain in case it decides to come down. So, as I said, this is the side where the Americans were standing, where their troops were. In fact, right where this ship behind you folks is, that's where Jackson made his headquarters during the Battle of New Orleans, known as the McCarty House. In the 1890s, that plantation house did burn down, and as St. Bernard Parish is starting to industrialize, that actually becomes what's known as the Chalmette Slit. Now on the British side, they landed about 3 miles downriver from us. In fact, kind of the far side of that refinery behind me today, that's where the Villeray plantation was. And the Villeray plantation was where the British made their headquarters. In fact, they took the Villeray men and locked them up in the second floor as prisoners of war. And when it's all said and done, the British will have landed about 7,000 total troops. Now the Americans had a very diverse army. In fact, when Jackson first hears that the British are coming to New Orleans, he immediately gathers the small force he has, only about 1,000 regular troops or so, and he makes his way to New Orleans. But he realizes that this 1,000 troops won't be enough to actually defend the city, so he declares martial law and then starts recruiting men from all different walks of life to join his army. He ends up putting out the call and getting Tennessee and Kentucky militia. He gets Louisiana militia. He gets New Orleans volunteers, including over 500 free people of color, 50 Choctaw warrior. He gets groups that have immigrated from the Canary Islands, known as Los Isleños. He gets German and Irish immigrants that have lived here. He gets people that have businesses, Creole businessmen, right out of the French Quarter there, who may own shops, taking weapons and coming out here to help defend the city. When it's all said and done, Jackson has an army of around 4,000 total troops, but he's missing some very specific equipment, like flints for muskets and gunpowder for both muskets and cannon. He's also missing men that know how to use cannons effectively. You see, when your army is made up mostly of volunteers and militia, this highly specialized skill just isn't something that's especially common. But this is one of those points in the story when Jackson catches a little bit of a lucky break, when he meets with a pirate known as Jean Lafitte, the same pirate that we're named after here. Now, Jean Lafitte had been getting in just a little bit of trouble with the governor of Louisiana. In fact, his brother had been put in prison, some of his other men were in prison, his headquarters has just been raided and some of his goods confiscated. But Lafitte himself had not been captured. And Lafitte realized that he had the equipment that Jackson needs. And it turns out when you're a pirate, you get pretty good at shooting cannon. So he offers a deal to Jackson. He says, in exchange for my men fighting out here at the battlefield, all we ask is pardons for all of our previous piracy. Now, at first Jackson calls these men hellish banditti, who aren't fit to fight on the same battlefield as American soldiers. But pretty quickly, Jackson realizes without these men and without this equipment, he simply won't be able to defend the city. And he makes that deal, and the Barratarians join the army as well. So, like I said, it is a very diverse force that's helping defend the city. Now, the reason that Jackson and his engineers picked this specific spot to make their stand against the British is for one very particular reason. And that's because between the river and the swamp, which would have been located somewhere near where that line of trees is today, it's the narrowest chunk of ground all the way back into the city. It's only about 3/4 of a mile long or so. And this means that Jackson can concentrate his smaller force in this kind of choke point, negating some of the British's superior numbers. In addition, Jackson sees a small mill race known as the Rodriguez Canal. The remains of it are one of the few physical reminders of the battle, and it's actually this ditch right behind me that still exists today. When Jackson sees this canal, he orders it dug out to about 15 feet wide and 8 feet deep, and then flooded with water from the Mississippi. Then he has all that mud and muck that's been dug out piled onto this side of the canal and creates a long wall-like fortification known as a rampart. We do have a recreation of what that might have looked like just a little further down, although I will mention that our recreation is a bit shorter and a bit narrower than it would have been in real life. It was close to 8 feet tall and 15 feet wide or so. Then Jackson has all of his cannons placed onto this side of the rampart. So now when the British attack, they'll have to cross that canal, scale that wall, the entire time being shot at by cannons, firing grape shot, basically giant shotguns. And so the British, led by General Packenham, decided to launch a three-pronged ground assault. But one thing to keep in mind is that every morning General Packenham, the British general, had woken up to a fog so thick out here on the battlefield, he probably couldn't see you folks from where I'm standing today. And so he really counted on that cover to be something that would help his men get close enough to the rampart to execute the plan. Unfortunately for the British, however, on the day of the attack, right after the troops are launched, the fog lifts and they become sitting ducks for the American artillery. Now the three-pronged attack, the first line of attack is actually right along the swamp end here. And this is because the British had heard that that was the weakest point in the entire rampart. And for a while this had been true. But Pierre Lafitte, Jean's brother, had actually warned Jackson that he should extend that rampart further into the swamp. And so Jackson did exactly that, extending it to about 400 more yards into the swamp, and then adding a battalion of Tennessee sharpshooters. So when the British go and attack, expecting very little resistance, they actually attack one of the strongest points on the entire line, and they take massive casualties in the Cypress Swamp there. Now the second line of attack is actually right alongside the levee here, and the British's plan here was to bring ladders and fascines. Fascines are kind of these big bundles of sugarcane sticks taken from the nearby plantations that they could throw into the canal, and then lay their ladders right on top of that rampart wall so that they could swarm over the top and take out the artillery that was causing so many casualties. On the day of the attack, it was Colonel Mullins who was charged with bringing those ladders, but he forgets to bring the ladders. Yeah, so instead of being able to swarm over the top, they get bottlenecked down on the levee end as well. They take another set of massive casualties there. Now the third line of attack, you can't really see from where you're standing right now, but if you go to the top of the monument, or when you go back to the Creole Queen, look at the opposite bank of the river. On the west bank, Jackson had a set of cannons who were shooting diagonally onto the battlefield. And the British general, General Packenham, thought that if he captured that position, he could turn those cannons onto the main American line, ending the threat of artillery that way. So he tasked a man named Colonel Thornton with capturing that position, and Colonel Thornton had been fighting in Europe for quite a while. And I like to think his mind was kind of stuck there because he thought that the Mississippi flowed nice and gently like a lot of the European rivers. So by the time his men have paddles in hand ready to cross, they're about 1.5 miles downriver. Now they do eventually capture that position. In fact, it's the only successful line of attack for the British, except it comes almost 2 hours too late. Out here on the main battlefield, General Packenham had ridden out on his horse to help direct his troops when he gets shot and then eventually dies from his wounds. Many of the other British officers are also killed or wounded, and the British lines get thrown into absolute chaos. After about 2 hours, the British are called into full retreat, but in that 2 hours, they will have taken almost 2,000 casualties. And this is in comparison with the Americans, who took less than 20 casualties. So it's a very decisive victory out here at the Battle of New Orleans. And you know, with the way that the news and the newspapers worked at the time, is they were pretty slow. The American people didn't realize that the Treaty of Ghent, which would have ended the war, had already been negotiated in Ghent, Belgium, about 3 weeks prior to this battle. Now, the treaty itself did require it to be ratified both in the Houses of Parliament and Congress before the war would end, and that ratification doesn't happen until about 5 weeks afterwards. So the Battle of New Orleans did still need to take place, but the American people really think it's this battle that forces the British to accept terms, not realizing that they'd already accepted those terms 3 weeks prior to this battle. It's also this battle that throws Andrew Jackson into such popularity that he's able to win the presidency in 1828. He had already had the nickname Old Hickory when he was here, but he gains a new one, and that's the Hero of New Orleans, which sticks with him up until his death. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is this idea of what it means to be American really comes out of the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans. The men that were fighting here thought of themselves as Tennessean or Kentuckian or New Orleanian or Creole or all these very localized ways in which they thought of themselves. But after the battle, we start getting all sorts of things, like the American National Anthem, which comes out of the War of 1812. We get the American English Dictionary, which, since we can't really use that Oxford thing anymore, now that our nation has proved that democracy can survive. We get tons of other books, songs, poems, all written about the war and about the battle. In fact, that Johnny Horton song that you folks heard coming off the boat there, the Battle of New Orleans, the tune of that actually comes from a fiddle tune that was played during the glorious 8th of January, which was a celebration that was celebrated across the United States, kind of on par with the 4th of July in terms of size and importance, all the way up until the Civil War. And it's really after this battle that for the first time we start to think of ourselves as Americans first, something that to this day we still do. And with that, I'll let you explore the battlefield. If you have any questions, I'll stay out for a couple minutes to answer those. Enjoy your time and have a good one.